Okay, in the spirit of John Boyd, context is king. So I'm a little old enough where if you remember the San Francisco 49ers, kind of the 80s, their lead quarterback was Joe Montana at the time. Joe Montana gets traded, goes to the Chiefs, and who comes up next? Anyone know? Steve Young. And they just kept winning, right? Talent wins. So we had a very similar experience here. We were setting this up, are looking for speakers who could talk about fight outnumbered and win. And if you're anyone with the Dark Rifles back in NTC, Colonel Hook, you'll know the story. Okay, so Colonel Hook, anyway, and I had him to come up and talk about fight outnumbered and win. And unfortunately, just on the spot, he had a family emergency that he had to go attend to. So I was like, hey, who else could do it? And much like, Joe Montana got traded, thankfully we have Steve Young, who came on and was able to get here. He's incredible. Brigadier General Landry is going to come. He's commanded just, I think, everything in the Canadian Army. He is now the Deputy Commander of First Corps. And that's something you just, look, that's your best. So we talked about it, what he could share and how he's commanded a brigade. The Canadians, that's all they're about. The size of their military, they're always fighting outnumbered and winning. So I couldn't think of a better person, sir. I cannot tell you thanks enough for accepting this. I mean, just right off the bench. So he did it like, a week notice. So with that, sir, thank you so much.
Okay, so a few years ago, I was training at Canadian Forces Gagetown, which is in New Brunswick, completely at the other end of the continent next to Maine. And I'm in my tank, and I hear something in the brushes, and then I turn and I see something moving. It is a bull moose. It was as high as the tank. And I'm like, well, we have to make it move. We can't continue training. So we tried a bunch of things like waving it off and, honking and yelling at it. It wouldn't budge. So Command Sergeant Major and I, we get out of the vehicle. We go in front of the moose, tip our hat and say, we're sorry, Mr. Moose, but the Canadians have to train here. So he was satisfied with this typical Canadian politeness, and he walked away. So what are we learning from this, right? The moose was clearly outnumbered, but he couldn't resist Canadian politeness. So anyways, I'm super happy to be here. Thanks, Craig, for the invite. I think I'm well suited to talk to you about fighting outnumbers, right? So the entire Canadian Army would fit on JBLM. The Army has only 3 Compo 1 brigades and 10 Compo 2 brigades, right? So I ended up commanding one of those Compo 1 brigades, the 2nd Brigade, which is very, very similar to an SBCT. We have a brigade deployed in Latvia now, and as you can imagine, if the Russians decide to cross over, the Canadians will be just a speed bump, right? There's no way we can have enough forces to contain them, so we have to use our imagination. And the scenario I'm going to walk you through was my warfighter as a brigade commander, where we had a realistic scenario, and I'll tell you what happened during the exercise, some lessons learned, and most importantly, what we can learn from this, because the challenges are the same, right? So the purpose is just that, right? I don't think we can afford to relearn what we've learned before. We talked about the speed of change in this complex environment. If we are constantly relearning the same lessons, there's no way we can modernize. There's no way we can introduce new capabilities. So the idea is let's make sure that when we've tried something and it didn't work, well, we don't have to go full circle, right? We can try something different. The tactical challenges that we live today are still relevant. And while I think at the senior level, we discuss a lot about strategy, operational readiness. But in forums like this, we rarely talk about down-to-earth dirt tactics. And it's at the brigade level, but it's still, they're things that we did, and I think they're relevant to everybody here in the room because they're highly tactical. I'm going to talk quickly about the 3 dimension of interoperability, right? So the technical interoperability, I have to say, as an ally of the US, it's very difficult to keep up with the technology that the US is constantly purchasing, to a point where my opinion is that it's actually dangerous for the US Army to outpace its ally to a point where they can't keep up. However, in terms of crisis, you can throw money at this problem, right? You can solve it relatively easily by spending the right amount of money. Procedural interoperability is slightly more complicated, but I think like doing symposiums like this, doing exercises, like I know that 39 Brigade is coming down here to train. When we train with different nations, when we deploy with different nations, those procedures, even if sometimes, like the Thais, you don't speak the same language, you can develop those procedures together. You can understand how each other work in a combined environment, but you need to practice. So it's a little harder. I think the hardest to me is the last one, is that human interoperability, because you need to be able to trust your allies. And in terms of crisis, you can surge for people, you can surge for resources, you can surge money. You'll never be able to surge trust, right? Remember that trust is the only thing you gain by giving it away. So I would encourage you, your first reaction when working with partners and allies is to just trust them first and then let them prove you wrong. Because if we don't trust our allies first, I think it's hard to ask them to reciprocate. Okay, some of the SBCTs today, what I didn't mention is, beside being the DCGO for America's First Corps, I also play the role as the executive director for the Stryker Warfighting Forum. So everything that has to do with all 8 Stryker formations across the Army, my team and I are involved in, right? So R-Struck, fielding the 30 millimeter turret, the new DV1 hulls and all that. I'm involved in all this. So, and quarterly we meet the whole community. And I can tell you, like, I get lessons learned from NTC, from JRTC, from deployments over in Europe or KRF rotations, and the challenges are very similar. What I hear from SBCT commanders are very similar to what I have lived as a brigade commander. So the loss of the CAV squadron, right? Luckily, the 81st doesn't get to lose its CAV squadron, but you're down an infantry battalion, right? So it's the same type of challenge, right? To try to fight with 3 elements instead of 4. The introduction of UAVs and the counter UAV fight, like everybody is interested to talk about this. The whole Stryker modernization and how we do this, and it makes sense. The training bill associated with a fully modernized Stryker is extremely high, and it will be a big challenge for the 81st when you receive the new Strykers. So all that to say, hopefully you can learn something from my experience, but and you find it interesting. Okay, so we'll go to the next. All right. Okay, so what is a Canadian Mechanized Brigade group like? I'm going to talk about my MTO. So the standard formation, all 3 CMBGs are very much alike. So you're talking about brigade headquarters, and then you have an armor regiment, typically 2 mech battalions, 1 light battalion. And then what I had was a CAV, we call it CAV squadron, but it's a company size element. And I was placed in a situation where it normally falls under my armor regiment or acts on his own. But for this specific exercises, I was given a new concept, a new unit that was called the Combat Support Group, which was provided by a different division. They brought new capabilities to my brigade, and their main goal was to sense, right? I'm fully aware that not every NAI could be serviced by an unmanned system, so I think you always need boots on the ground. So therefore, what I did is I took my own eyes, I took my reconnaissance squadron and gave it to this 05 command, who was in charge of all sensing functions, right? So within the brigade, it's listed here what I had: Raven MUAVs, the light counter mortar radar, mobile electronic warfare technology. I had information activities and some of the, what you see here listed as recce assets. Those are the battalion reconnaissance platoons, right? Higher ISR, I had a div recce. So that's for the div. We had access to the information and intelligence that they produced, but they were the House Cavalry Guard from the Brits, the UK, and a full battalion size reconnaissance element that was working right for my boss, the div commander, and then other higher assets. So if you look to the right of the slide, I just want to explain how I decided to reorganize my own forces to suit my mission. So you see on top, all the sense functions were under that CSG. And you'll see that I gave them my my light reconnaissance squadron. They had EW, the UAV, and the counter mortar radar. So those are all my sensing functions, and I put them all under lieutenant colonel. Then I had two mech battalions, mech infantry battalion, one on the left and one on the right. You'll notice that the one on the right I gave a tank company to provide more mobility. However, I kept most of my armor forces in what I call the covering force. And I'll explain later what they did. But so the idea was to have a force that is highly mobile to act as a covering force. Then for rear area security and all the IDP coordination, I tasked my light battalion. I kept just a company in reserve. I have an aviation battalion that was mainly for movement and some ISR, but they're not attack helicopter, they're UHs. And then you see fires and sustainment. All right, so those were the resources I had to solve my problem set. Now, if we go to the next slide, this is just to show you what Canadian equipment looks like. So our main battle tank is the Leopard 2. It's a very capable tank. I commanded a squadron of it in Afghanistan, and it did fantastic in super hot weather. It's really good in cold weather too. So we really like the Leopard tank. Our labs, they're very similar to a Striker. They're equipped with a 25 millimeter gun, which is it's good for counter reconnaissance. It could kill some soft targets. Maybe a BTR, but I don't think you can kill a BMP or certainly not a tank, right? And then the light infantry, they could be moved in Chinooks. And all I had was the M777 howitzer for my own brigade artillery, all right? Okay, so this is my problem set. So obviously, as a brigade commander, my number one task was to bitch about my boss's plan. So in typical Canadian form. So the div plan was essentially, their role was to delay the enemy and destroy them at a river crossing. The battle space, my boss's battle space, the div border was right at the Russian border. Right? And the plan was to have the div reconnaissance in front, and then behind two mechanized brigades, behind that a major obstacle, and which was a river, and behind that was two other brigades, and the triple nickel that was attached to our division for that exercise to counterattack and destroy the enemy. So that's the plan. The major flaw that I identified in that plan was that Division Recce was never given their own battle space. So my boss's plan was to have the Household Cavalry, that battalion, operate in mine and my sister brigade's AO, and I found it very confusing and very counterintuitive. So I try to sell the plan that, no, if they're going to be in front of me, they need to have their own battle space, because their role is to trade time for space and not destroy a lot of enemy, but give me a lot of information. So if they don't have the space, I don't think they can do their job effectively, right? And I'll tell you later how it happens, but anyways, that poor lieutenant colonel from UK was trying to sell that to my boss, that he needs a lot more space. He was asking for 15 kilometers. He got 2. So he got a band of 2 kilometers between the Russian border and the front line of my troops. So this is how I arrayed my own forces. So right in front of us, again, you have that Div Recce. But if you look at that screen, what you see, the CSG screen, my rationale was like, if I don't have enough space to spread my forces horizontally, so over space like this, I will stack them up, right? So I had different unmanned systems that I could stack at different elevations and very little on the ground. And the idea was to get my information that way. They had only one company, right? That CSG only had one company that could that could service NAIs that couldn't be serviced by unmanned systems, and they ended up not being in front of my infantry. They were actually off to the side servicing other NAIs, other avenues of approach. I was worried about getting flanked from the north, so this is essentially where those reconnaissance troops went. Behind that screen that was provided by my CSG, in the north, the terrain was heavily wooded and very, very complex, very constricted. So I focused more on lighter forces. And in the south, the battalion that was there, there were many fast avenue, like highways, so fast avenues of approach. So this is why they got some tanks, and they were far more mobile. So although if you look at the screen, the space that the North Battalion had to cover was much more, it was actually a lot harder to cover the South just because the way the roads went. So behind them was what I called my covering force. So the covering force was essentially all my tanks, well, most of my tanks, and they had some mechanized infantry with them, and the idea was for them to react depending on how the battle went, right? I'm sure you've heard before, fight the enemy, not the plan. Well, although I thought I had the best plan possible, I knew that, if something went wrong, I needed to have something to react without committing my reserve. So that's why I created that covering force, which, is maybe a bit counterintuitive, because why would you keep all your tanks behind? But when the idea is to delay the enemy and suck them in, you don't want to put all your best foot forward, right? You want to kind of draw them in. Behind that, my light battalion was retaining key terrain. It was a major crossroad in a small village. So this is where they were. Essentially, what I didn't want is the enemy to be able to kind of cut me off and seize that. So I left troops there. And at the very end, you see there's this border with the 5th Brigade. So the idea was for us to ARPL through 5th Brigade. So that was my plan, right? So a screen, then 2 dug-in mechanized battalions supported by labs. Behind that, I had a covering force, mainly equipped with tanks. Behind that, I had some light forces retaining key terrain, all right? So that was my plan. And the idea, like what I was trying to sell the brigade is over the course of the battle, so over time, you will always gain, lose initiative, right? And you can predict that, right? So you see at the top of this graph, the peaks, they're all major brigade events. So this is where I would consume most of my combat power. So obviously, in between these peaks, you'll have valleys where you will need to rebuild that combat power, get resupplied, get more ammo, get maybe replacement troops. So the danger with this construct is the enemy can exploit when you're actually consolidating, you're in these valleys, right? And like Robert Lienhardt said, we have to exploit the enemy's unreadiness. Well, they're trying to do the same thing, right? So they're trying to exploit when I'm in my valleys. So the idea of the covering force is to do exactly that. Give another dilemma to the enemy and force them to choose between fighting what's right in their face or trying to exploit my weakness, right? So give an extra dilemma to the enemy to create this other force. It doesn't have to be armor. It could be like an air assault, right? It could be, we have at core, we have the MDAC, the multi-domain task force, the MDTF, multi-domain task force. Using long-range fires, you can create this. The idea is just to have something else that keeps the enemy busy when you have to reconsolidate, right? And the danger now is those transitions, right? So this is now that you tried to replicate or keep the enemy busy when you're in your valleys, where you become the most vulnerable are those transitions, right? Because this is when, as a brigade commander, I have to make sure that I know who's in charge at all times. I probably have attack forward to make sure I can see the battle space. I can have good comms because this is where I'm vulnerable, right? The different troops will be facing the enemy, and that transition has to be as fast as possible, right? So I think the Cav Squadron is the best equipped to manage those transitions. But when you realize that it's a weakness, then you can protect it, right? So think about all the warfighting functions. Those transitions is where I would put a lot of effort on my G3-4 and say, hey, AMD, counter battery fires, this is when, you're being paid, right, during these transitions. Okay? Roger so far? All right. Okay. So, hopefully you can see the map is still behind those wavelengths. And now I'm going to try to explain to you how the battle actually unfolded, right? Because we did learn a lot from that. So, first of all, without any surprise, the Div Recce was obliterated in minutes, all right? They just didn't have the space to fight, right? So, as soon as, because remember, in a battle like this, the main challenge at the start is you don't have the initiative, right? You have to be ready, but you don't know when they're going to attack, right? They say they will, but so you have to be ready, and you can't keep soldiers ready that long, right? So you're trying to predict when they're going to cross. You look at the weather, you look at different factors, but you do not have the initiative, right? So when the Russians crossed, Div Recce was quickly wiped. So the first thing they hit then was my dug-in infantry. And I was fully expecting them to try to use the high-speed approaches, so the south, and that's not what they did, right? So they went up top, and they started to kill the companies of that North Battalion one by one, to a point where instead of having, so my flot, instead of being straight like this, it was completely slanted like that, right? And this is where that covering force really paid dividends. So because the tanks were not fixed and they were centered in the middle of my AO, I was able to quickly redirect them to the north, where the terrain was less favorable, but they could still move there faster than, let's say, light infantry. And I was able to to plug that gap, right? And as I did that, I started to withdraw some of the forces in the south to bring as much as possible the flot parallel to that river that was about 20 or 30 kilometers behind us. The other challenge also is, if this happens, you don't want to create a seam between my own brigade and my sister brigade, right? So maintaining communication with the other brigade was really important as well, because his fight was going a lot better than mine, right? So he needs to know to retrograde, even though they're doing a good fight and everything's fine, they have to retrograde with me, otherwise they will get flanked, right? So what happened is the tanks were able to fight back and regain the initiative to allow my 2 infantry battalions to ARPL through the tanks and get another defensive position that was pre-dug in, but it was still east of that river, to have another kind of blocking position for them. So once they were in position, I was able to disengage my tanks. They went backwards all the way across the river. Then one last push from those 2 mech infantry battalions, and then they retrograded on the other side of the river. And then once the enemy hit the river and started deploying bridges and all that, the other brigade hit them. So that's essentially what happened. I think it's it could have gone anywhere between here and there. I think we did okay. But I think the saving grace was that covering force that was able to plug those gaps, right? So if we go to the last slide, I want to talk about some major lessons learned from that exercise. I hear a lot of, through RStruck, all the brigade commanders that are losing their Cav squadron. One of the solutions that they're looking at is to get all the reconnaissance platoons together and create either a reconnaissance company, or what I hear sometimes is a multi-dimension effects company. Well, they'll put like snipers, reconnaissance, robotics like UAVs, sometimes anti-tank. The problem with this is if you put 3 platoons together, they're not equipped, especially if you push them forward, they're not equipped to sustain themselves, right? So it's very dangerous to send troops on their own if they don't have their own tail, and they have to rely on you pushing supply versus them having the ability to reach back and get what they need and bring it back to the flot, right? So essentially, those support dependencies are essential. If you're going to have these newly created sense type elements forward, you need to ensure that they'll be sustained properly, and they have to be able to reach back. So you have to dedicate resources, give them their own trucks, give them their own line of aviation, so maybe they can get like Chinook resupply or whatever, but it needs to be baked in your plan. If you move to the top right quadrant, ground maneuver reconnaissance, the loss of USs presented a challenge, and again proved the importance that you'll always need some kind of foot reconnaissance or ground reconnaissance. I was at JPMRC yesterday. The bad weather, so high winds combined with super, super cold, I'm talking like with the wind chill below -40, it prevented them from using any of their UAS. It's true for the enemy, you're going to tell me? Yes. However, you still need eyes, right? So it proved once more that, although I fully understand the Army's decision to, close down a bunch of Cav squadrons to get these people and to do other things in the Army, most brigades will try to recreate some kind of reconnaissance element at a hide, and it might mean training infantry soldiers to do it, which will probably not have the proficiencies of 19 Deltas, but everybody kind of agreed that we'll never get rid of these soldiers completely. One more thing that is super important for ground maneuver reconnaissance is it's one thing to have soldiers forward gathering data, but now with a bunch of UASs and all the sensors that we have out, if all you're pushing back is data, you're going to overload the commander, right? So it's really important to have the ability to fuse this data forward, right? And what I used to call, I still call it that, decision grade information, right? So all these scouts, they don't need to tell me everything they know, right? They need to tell me what you need to know as a commander. So fuse the information, get me the so what, look at 3 different NAIs and say, okay, because this has happened, therefore we think the enemy is going into his most likely COA, they will use this bridge, and therefore this is where we're going to strike him. That's the kind of information I need from the scouts, not 3 tanks reported on NAI 005, right? That's good for the PL, but we need to be able to fuse this and fuse it forward. And what that reconnaissance element that I had, that CSG, what was really good is they had a company of intelligence of MI integrated in that 05 command, so they could fuse the information right there. The other thing also is that layered approach of ground reconnaissance, I think, is no longer relevant. So the old World War II or Cold War kind of reconnaissance where you would have div reconnaissance, picket different contacts, and then hand it over to brigade reconnaissance, who would hand it over to battalion reconnaissance, and then you'd finally strike it. I think you can cut at least one or two of these levels. Again, understanding that you'll need some ground reconnaissance at some point. You don't need it at every echelon, right? You have to be more deliberate about most of my sensors can cover this big area, and therefore I don't need to send humans there, right? So I think we have to rethink this model and say, okay, instead of handing out over contact from div to brigade to battalions to companies, well, you know, if division sees it, with the ITN that we have and all the systems that we have, if div reconnaissance sees something, everybody in the div can see it, right? So the actual icon will appear on your screen, right? So all you need is to validate that it's still there, and that's far less resource intensive than having actual soldiers clover leafing over an objective, right? Okay, let me take you down to bottom left. Being able to sense and shoot quickly and using partners or allies interchangeably, I think is a major advantage. And like we heard from John Antal, that will really help us to obtain that decision dominance, right? If we were at Yamasakura, for example, last year, if a Japanese sensor sees something, well, maybe it's an American launcher that prosecutes that target, right? We have to be really good at this. And it's true within the Army, like within the div, maybe Brigade number 1 sensor sees something, and then that target is prosecuted by Brigade number 2, or fires from Corps, or whatever, right? So that sensor to shooter link is important. And again, the technology that goes behind that, what AI can do, the Corps now works with the Maven smart systems, what AI can do to prosecute targets super fast. Last month in Japan, the Rangers, 75th Ranger, they're seeing targets. They're able to themselves put those targets in the system, and then the launchers from 17 Fab from Corps Rocket Artillery would engage them, right? So imagine the time you save, right? And anyways, I saw it at a much smaller scale with my brigade, but it's relevant at all echelons. The last one is I want to talk about command relationships. So the CSG that I had was from a different division, right? Integrate them early. As a brigade commander, I went and visited them in their building in a different province to make sure we established a connection. We invited them to several exercises. We did exactly the same for Yamasakura with all the Compo 2 and Compo 3 people who helped us for the warfighter. We involved them early. We worked with the 303rd MEB out of Hawaii. We met them more than 6 months before, right? So again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning of the presentation, right? You can't surge trust. Well, you have to build it in over time. So those relationships are super important. And then the last point, I think I talked about it, right? The ability to service all NAIs, look at your plan, and look at the best resource to service that NAI. We need more and more to think outside of the box. And maybe I don't own that resource that can service that NAI, but maybe I can use all my systems to find somebody who can give me that information and relay it back to me, right? So this is what I wanted to talk about. Essentially, this exercise is about just over almost 3 years old. Things change fast, but I think most of what I talked about today is still relevant. So what I encourage you to do is talk to people who do different trades, right? Talk to people who have different capabilities, and it links super well with the presentation we had over lunch, right? To identify people who have complementary skills. It's true in any types of warfare, right? So the more you learn before we get the fight for real, the better prepared you'll be. Thank you very much, and I have time for some questions.
Sir Major Fry, XO for 30161. We talked about interoperability and about getting soldier sensor to fires. How have you found in working with the U.S. and vice versa a way to overcome the challenge of our comms don't play with your comms, so that we want to still be able to fire quickly, but how have you overcome that challenge?
Sadly, because this is not what this brigade was meant for, we used SFAB. So I know that SFAB is meant to, integrate partners who are not necessarily Five Eyes, but it worked. I think, SFAB could be used to train soldiers much more efficiently. But so what we ended up doing is we would have SFAB with key elements, and they would be there essentially just for comms. It worked well. But I think, we can do better than dedicate SFAB to working with Canadians, right?
I think we have time for one more.
Otherwise, I'll talk about hockey or maple syrup. Hey, how do you get 50 Canadians out of a pool? Just say, please get out of the pool. Thank you.